I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. This is part 3 in my video series where I am building a beast-class quadcopter. And if you don't know what that is, it's freaking awesome. It's gigantic. It's dangerous. It's stupid. And you can go back and check the playlist in the video description to start at part 1. I'm just going to dive right into the video as soon as I put in my mandatory safety disclaimer that I'm putting at the beginning of all of these videos. The video you're about to watch documents the process of building a beast-class quadcopter. There is no how-to video on how to safely build a machine like this. That's like saying I watched a how-to video on base jumping and now I'm going to go jump off a building. If you decide that you would like to build one of these awesome machines, before you do, ask yourself this question. Am I an idiot? If the answer to that question is yes, do not build one of these machines. In all seriousness, guys, this is a whole nother level of danger compared to a typical 5-inch mini quad freestyle. If you decide to build one of these, build it safely and fly it safely, and don't make me and Catalyst Machine Works regret that we put this stuff out there. On with the video. The first thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to install the power connectors onto the batteries and onto the quadcopter discharge leads. And that's not going to be as simple as you might think. You're probably used to this kind of connector, which is an XT60, and it's rated for up to 60 amps. Ooh, isn't that cute? And in fact, an XT60 will do more than 60 amps because it's 60 amps continuous. And we don't run continuously above 60 amps very often, not on most mini quads. But on this guy, we're going to be pulling several hundreds of amps. In fact, the PDB that we've got is rated for like 400 or 500 amps. Yikes. So we're going to use these connectors. These are Amass AS1507mm gold-plated anti-spark power connectors. And I had never heard of these before, but again, I'm just going with Catalyst Machine Works recommendations. Now, the first part of getting to be smart is knowing when you're dumb and then being real careful and trying to learn to do things right. And I want to acknowledge to you guys that that's what I'm doing now. Obviously, I've put together bullet connectors before, but these aren't exactly like standard bullet connectors. So like standard bullet connectors, there's a male plug and a female connector that the male plug goes into. But there's actually 2 different male plugs here, one of them with this little ring, and that is the anti-spark technology. So the male plugs are going to go into these larger, shorter sheathings. And the anti-spark one is going to go in the positive. And then the female ones, I think, are the same. And they're going to go into these thinner, longer connectors. And that's how it's going to go together. So I believe this is correct. And I'm going to just sort of snapshot that as I'm soldering this up to try to make sure I do it correctly. It's important that we cut these main discharge leads short enough that they can't easily get into the props. So I've just looked at approximately how Catalyst Machine Works has done their build. I'm just going to like eyeball it to a couple inches past the edge of the frame. I'm going to strip that. And for this guy, we're going to get one of these connectors, and it's going to be one of the female connectors. And it's just going to get soldered on like so. I'm going to put my big honking soldering iron tip back on. Let's talk for a minute about this soldering. A few people have told me that my use of 850 degrees Fahrenheit is unacceptable, is bad technique, and that I should be using a heavier tip. You're probably right about that. But 2 things. I don't have a heavier tip. This is the heaviest tip I have. And I don't lift pads, right? If I were running at 850 and I were lifting pads all the time and damaging boards, then I'd be like, okay, well, clearly something isn't right. But if you can run at 850, doesn't that mean that you get in and out faster? You put less heat essentially into the board than if you have to sit there longer And especially given that I don't have a heavier tip, if I were to use the lower temperature, it would just take me longer to do the joints. So as long as I'm not lifting pads, what's the freaking deal? I freely admit that I am not a NASA trained solderer. I have watched those videos on, you know, Joe Schmo from NASA teaches you how to solder. And like, I know the steps. And like one of the things I got criticized, one person criticized me for was not cleaning. After I tin the joint, I didn't clean it with alcohol, and that creates oxides that compromise the integrity of the joint. Well, yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm not building a freaking spaceship, though. I acknowledge that that's the exact kind of excuse that people always use when they are performing subpar work. But at the end of the day, you know, the results for me speak for themselves. I mean, I'm not some Yahoo who's got just terrible, janky, crappy solder joints falling and the quads falling out of the sky. I don't lift pads. My solder joints are solid. I feel like the results speak for themselves. So let's just be sure here. We're going to install the sheath, and then we're going to install this guy. It seems perfectly sized for 10 gauge wire. The 10 gauge wire will not go any further in. And then we're just going to need to solder it here. And to be honest with you, I don't know the sort of correct technique for this. I'm just going to have to wing it. And my goal when I'm soldering is always get the whole joint molten and let it solidify together and make sure that everything is smooth. And for me, as long as I've done that, it's probably is good enough. I mean, it's not like we're building a nuclear power plant or a spaceship and the joint has to be perfect 30 years from now. Or, you know, we need like 1 micro ohm of resistance versus 2 micro ohms. You know, should I tin this first and get some solder in there, or should I just heat it and go for it? I think I'm just going to heat it and go for it. I'm going to need to figure out how to get the heat onto this guy. I could heat from the underside. I've done that in the past. And then heat from the underside and wait for the metal to get hot enough that it takes the solder. So I'm going to heat from the side maybe and be careful not to touch the threads. Oh, there we go. Now it's taking. So I fed in a bunch of solder, and then I reflowed the whole joint. It looks a little gray. It probably could use a little more flux, but maybe it could use a little more solder. Maybe I could feed some more in. I really needed a bigger gauge solder for this job, to be honest. I will freely admit that this is the weakest part of the build for me. But I'm going to go with that. So then this guy is going to just thread on. Please thread on. Yes, it's going to work. As long as I'm acknowledging some critiques of my soldering technique, another thing I got critiqued for was not putting these wires through the holes on the PDB. The holes aren't big enough for a 10 gauge wire. It won't go through there, so that's why I didn't do that. Some people suggested that I should have split the wire and done it to the top and bottom of the pad. That definitely would increase its current carrying capacity. I checked with Catalyst MachineWorks, and the way I did it on top of the pad is exactly how they did it. And that's how we're going to go with it. All right, so I've installed the female positive and negative connector onto the Quadcopter PDB, and I've shortened them up so they're not going to get into the props. The next thing I need to do is I need to install the connectors on the battery. And for those of you who are watching along in amazement, but who are too beginnerish to have ever done this before, I'll point this stuff out. For those of you who are actually doing this build, of course, you already know this. When you're putting a new connector on a battery, one thing you definitely don't do is just, because you'll short circuit them. And this is a 4,000 milliamp hour 6S. It will make a violent spark if you do that. So you're going to cut one at a time. And in fact, don't cut them both off. Leave the connector on the one you're not working with so that you never have more than one naked wire at a time, right? So this is pretty safe. The only way I could make a spark or a short would be if I were to jam it in there, and which of course I'm not going to do. It's not going to accidentally somehow come into contact. This is pretty safe. Another thing people sometimes do is they'll take this wire and they will tape it out of the way to keep it. I mean, if you did cut them both, you could tape it out of the way and keep it from getting in the way while you're working. That's probably not a bad idea. Maybe a rubber band would work. Oh yeah, that would be great. There we go. Now that is safely out of the way, and I can work on installing the connector on this guy. All right, folks, I'm going to show you my very last one of these joints where I've got it basically as good as I can. And I realize this is risky because if it looks like crap, then I'm going to get picked on for not being good at soldering. But, you know, let's just see how it goes. So I've tinned the joint coming. This is the wire coming from the battery. I'm going to make sure I put this sheath on, and I'm going to make sure it's the right one. Oh, see, and it isn't. Derp. Make sure it's the right one. I'll show you guys the final layout later. And then I'm going to take and I'm going to put the connector on. Now I haven't pre-tinned the connector, and the reason I haven't done that is because if I put the solder on there already, then I don't think I'll be able to get the wire on. And then what I would have to do is heat the whole thing until it flowed and then push it on. And that doesn't seem like the right way to go for me. What I'm doing here is I'm actually going to take some of these vice grip pliers, and I'm going to very, very carefully, with very loose tension, because I don't want to mess up these threads. The threads are engaging with plastic, so it's not the end of the world if they get a little mangled. Just very gently. And then I'm going to insert this guy like so. And that does a great job of holding everything together while I'm soldering so it doesn't move. Yeah, see, so it's going to hold everything together very nicely. If only there were some kind of tool that you could buy for soldering, like a third set of hands that would let you do this more easily. Ha ha ha. For these great big joints like this, definitely I'm going to add flux. If I had some of that, this is the one time in my life where I've kind of wished I had some of that flux that was in a syringe instead of a pen, because I could just squirt it on here. But instead, I'm going to just flux the crap out of it here. I usually don't like the syringes because they just put on so much flux that it's kind of annoying. And just add solder here. Just add a freaking gobload of it into the joint and then heat the whole thing. It's not straight, it's at a little bit of an angle, and the reason I did that is because I kind of want the wire pressed down into the bottom of the cup so it's making good contact with the underside. If I had a really good set of third hands, I could do this a little better and hold them in place while I worked them, but I don't. Now, if we want to be really critical of this, you can see a little bit of oxidation. There are little black specks here that are a little bit of oxidation, and that is not good. If I had cleaned this with alcohol before I had done it, and if I had used more flux, that probably wouldn't have happened. But overall, I mean, this, I'm going to go with it. I can see that there's good fusion all the way to the edges here and here. It looks like the whole thing has become liquid. The wire is fully down into the solder. Looking at the back side, there's a little air gap here to let air escape as the solder flows down into the bottom of the cup. I don't actually see that it has flowed here. It looks a little dry there on the underside. I might reflow it again, actually. And looking here in the back side, I can see flow all the way up into the wire. And that, to me, feels pretty good. I might reflow this again just to make sure that I get flow all, because I want to see, like if I look in this hole here, I don't want to see dry solder. I want to see like solder that has clearly become liquid. And I don't want to see any air gap. I want to know that solder has flowed all the way around to the backside here and is just fully making contact everywhere. So I might hit that with some more flux and reflow it. Maybe put some heat from the backside. The problem is I'm putting heat in from the top, And then it has to get all the way down through to the underside to really get that fusion and flow. Yeah, wow. Okay, so this is the result of reflowing this joint more thoroughly. And what I want you to see is this is the exact same amount of solder that was already in there. It was just heated until it became fully liquid and was allowed to flow down into the bottom. You can see there was much less solder in there than it looked like there was. So there you go. All right, well, like a disappointingly long time of hunched over my bench, soldering giant connectors later. And here's what I've got. Here on the quad itself, we've got two female connectors, a black and a red, a negative and a positive. And then on the batteries, basically the way that I did this was I just mentally sort of chased the circuit around. So we're going to take the positive on the quad. We're going to go to a positive male on the battery. And it's really important, again, a reminder that you use the anti-spark connector on the positives. And it's also important when you plug it in that you plug this one in last, because the anti-spark will only protect you if you see. So you have to plug the anti-spark in last because that's where the spark will happen. So female positive to male positive. We're not going to plug it in yet. Then female negative to male positive. And this is going to freak some of you out if you've never built a series connection battery before. But that's how series batteries work, is the negative of one becomes the positive of the other, and that causes their voltages to add up. So female negative to male positive to male negative to female negative. That's it. And the last thing we need is, for each of the batteries, we need an adapter, and this is what's going to let us charge the battery. I made this with only 14 gauge wire because the charging is not going to be happening that fast, but we got, make sure you don't screw these up. Yeah. Basically, you're just going to build the opposite of whatever it was so that you can do this. Now we can charge the batteries and we can power the quadcopter. And that's kind of terrifying because it means that there's only one thing left to do. And that's plug the damn thing in. Okay, so we're going to start at the negative. We're going to go negative. Positive to negative. Shoot. And now we should measure about 50 volts here. Let's just do that and see if that's correct. Well, these batteries are at storage, by the way. They're not fully charged, so. But I should measure from negative to positive. Am I going to get negative? I'll get negative here. 46 volts. That is correct. No smoke. No. You know, guys, every time I do a new build, I say, no smoke, no smoke, no smoke. It's just my little chant. But I've never meant it more than this. These ESCs are like $100 a piece. I'm not joking. I mean, I could just be about to blow $400. I'm really sure. I've checked all the wiring. I'm just going to do it. My heart is racing. One of the things people are saying in the comments to these videos is, why? Why? Why would you do this? This is stupid. 5-inch quads fly amazing. And one reason why is that this is why. Like, it just freaking plugged the battery in and my heart was racing. Can you imagine what it's going to feel like to fly it? One of the exciting things about mini quads is that the stakes are very low. I mean, they're not nothing. You lose a quad, you lose $150, $300, and you crash a quad and you're probably not going to, you know. So this is for people who maybe would like just a little bit of danger. Anyway, everything lit up, nothing smoked. I saw the receiver and the VTX power up. I think what I'm going to do next is I'm going to function check the camera, the VTX, and the flight controller. And then I can put the top on. And then I can solder up the motors, and we'll be basically, well, we'll have to do the configuration. But yeah, that's... If you have enjoyed this video, let me remind you that this is my full-time job. Oh. And if you want to support my medical bills for the stress of plugging in a freaking 12S quadcopter without knowing what's going to happen, there are links to all of these products down in the video description. And you can support me by clicking those affiliate links before you make any purchase. Not just how many of you guys are going to buy one of these, but Race Day Quads, Rotor Riot, Get FPV, Banggood, all these affiliated vendors. I get a small commission if you click those links before you make any purchase, and I sure do appreciate it. I also have a Patreon. If you want to throw me a couple bucks a month, you can join my Patreon. And if you do join the Patreon, one of the exclusive benefits you get is access to my Discord server, which some people like. Links to all of that in the video description. Thank you guys so much. We're almost ready to fly it, and that's going to be even more terrifying. But I'll let you know. Thanks for watching. Happy flying.